Thank you, Hannah. It's nice to be here. Thank you for the invitation. It's a very different format for me. I've never done this before, but I like the idea because in my master program, which was Transcultural Studies at the University of Bremen, was a combination of anthropology and, let's say, post-colonial literature. So I thought that's a great opportunity to read a book, finally, again, and relate it in one way or the other to anthropology. And I must admit right at the very beginning that I'm not at all an expert on Amitav Ghosh. So Gun Island was in fact, and perhaps to my shame, the first novel of his that I read. And then I thought, how do I go about it? And I decided I just read the book and I mark passages that resonate with my own research. And these passages either aligned with, conflicted with, or extended what I have experienced, observed, and analyzed as an anthropologist, so I'm an anthropologist by training, during field work over the past 10 years. And let me reveal right away, there were quite a few such passages, and I will only have time to talk about a very few during the roughly 10 minutes that I've prepared for you. So I will share some of the reflections and thoughts that arose during and after reading Gun Island, from the perspective of an anthropologist and ethnographer who conducts research both on migration at the European Union's external borders and on the arrival of and responses to harmful algae blooms in the Caribbean. An anecdote, I think, illustrates what Gun Island, in my understanding, convincingly argues and depicts. In 2019, when I concluded my research on displacement from sub-Saharan Africa to Malta and began studying algae in the Caribbean, I encountered quite a few surprised reactions both within and outside my academic community. The topics, people noted, seemed very different, almost worlds apart geographically and thematically, and they asked how I intended to connect and think about them together. Although politically and ethically very distinct, so treating young refugees in algae is of course different, my research, much like the book I guess, demonstrates that people are compelled to respond to external arrivals on shore, whether of refugees or ecological non-human arrivals like sargassum algae in the Caribbean. Both situations raise questions about responsibility, adaptation, and power relations in our contemporary world. They speak to, much like the novel, about invisibility, urban-rural relations, and cultures of ignorance. That's just a term that came to my mind when I read the book. It's like cultures of ignorance might be something we could talk about, and I'll talk about it a bit in a few more minutes. So Gun Island, I think, invites us to interpret coastal spaces as liminal zones where human-environment relations and social hierarchies are particularly pronounced. The sea, with its force and its waves, can render things visible and invisible, and themes of invisibility run throughout the novel, I guess. The sea in Gun Island connects disparate geographies, such as the Sundarbans, Venice, and LA, highlighting global interdependencies while simultaneously serving as a site of danger. As rising seas and more intensive storms threaten coastal communities worldwide, in both my actual research and in the novel, Ghosh's work underscores how water, as an actor and a metaphor, dissolves boundaries between the local and global, between Asia, Europe, and the United States, and between land and sea. And in my work as an anthropologist, I'm always interested in, let's say, deconstructing categories. So that's a theme that was important to me. Ghosh, I believe, uses water to emphasize the fragility of human constructs, such as borders and the socio-ecological divides between nature and culture. For example, Moyna's statement about the Sundarbans, and I quote here from the book, "Sometimes," said Moyna, "it seemed as though both land and water were turning against those who lived in the Sundarbans. When people tried to dig wells and arsenic-laced brew gushed out of the soil, When they tried to shore up embankments, the tides rose higher and pulled them down again. Reveals the relentless power of water in reshaping lives and landscapes, and the inability of humans to fully control it. In Gun Island, both humans and non-humans move and migrate, further demonstrating that migration is both a reaction to crisis and a fluid process that dissolves traditional boundaries or constructed boundaries, much like the sea itself does. People move between rural and urban spaces, and animals migrate as their habits are disrupted. As Gosh writes, no one knows where they belong anymore, neither humans nor animals. This sense of dislocation is not merely a consequence of climate change, but also a reflection of the Anthropocene's destabilization of established categories. Belonging becomes a transient concept tied not to fixed geographies, but to the shared experiences of precarity and adaptation. Through his characters' journeys, Gosh critiques, I believe, the unequal distribution of ecological burdens and the narratives required to navigate them. For instance, one character reflects, and I quote again, "Suppose a guy is applying for asylum in Sweden. He will need a story to back him up, and it can't be just any old story. It's got to be a story like they want to hear over there. Suppose the guy was starving because his land was flooded, or suppose his whole village was sick from the arsenic in their groundwater. None of that shit matters to the Swedes." Here, Gosh underscores how systemic inequalities shape migration narratives, privileging certain types of crises, political, religious, or sexual persecution, while ignoring the devastating impacts of environmental collapse. These dynamics reveal how migration is not merely about survival in the Anthropocene, but also about navigating the power structures that govern mobility and recognition. And that passage did remind me very much of the stories I heard during research in Malta, where the young refugees I worked with constantly tried to find out which narratives would lead to their protection in the European Union. The categories of the urban and the rural are also destabilized in the novel, with Gosh showing how crisis in one sphere inevitably ripple outward to affect the other. Gosh, I believe, juxtaposes flood-prone rural deltas with cosmopolitan hubs like Venice and LA, illustrating that neither sphere is insulated from the cascading effects of ecological disruption. This entanglement challenges the assumption that cities are secure havens in contrast to vulnerable rural spaces in times of climate and environmental degradation. Instead, Gosh portrays urban centers as both hubs of global interconnectedness and sites of ecological vulnerability, exposing the fragility of urban life. Furthermore, the novel critiques the very constructs that underpin power dynamics at different levels. One character admits, I quote, "I realized then that he was right. I did indeed believe in passports, visas, permits, green cards, and the like. For me, these weren't just pieces of paper or plastic. They possessed a certain kind of sacredness." By questioning the sacrosanct nature of borders and documents, Gosh highlights the artificiality of divisions, geographical, ecological, or bureaucratic, that separate sometimes rural and urban, local and global, native and invasive. Through Gun Island, I believe, Gosh invites us to rethink the Anthropocene as a shared, albeit unevenly experienced global condition. Whether human or non-human, rural or urban, all entities are implicated in these dynamics. As an anthropologist working on nature's cultures, I read Gosh's Gun Island as a multi-species story that challenges anthropocentric narratives about climate change. Animals such as dolphins and snakes, and I very much like the dolphin part because I once encountered Irrawaddy dolphins in Laos, are not passive entities in the novel but active participants. For me, Gun Island aligns with efforts to decenter human experiences in favor of more inclusive perspectives. Much of what Gosh wrote reminds me of my research on sargassum in the Caribbean, where its proliferation confronts communities with the limits of human control over nature. In tourist areas, for example, extensive efforts are made to remove the algae or block it with barriers to preserve the pristine image of white sandy paradisic beaches. New hotels are built in inland jungles so that tourists do not have to see the ugly algae at all. Yet, these interventions only underscore the futility of attempts to dominate nature. The algae always returns. Gosch's narrative resonates here, particularly with the scene where the hotel staff rearranges dining rooms to shield guests from the sight of destructive fires. I quote, "Next morning, there was much confusion in the lobby, largely because the hotel had rearranged its dining rooms so that its guests would not have to gaze at waves of flame as they breakfasted." Similarly, in Mexico, sargassum becomes a persistent reminder of human limits. The constant cleanup operations and infrastructural adjustments reflect a belief that nature can be controlled, even as it repeatedly defies these efforts. This recalls another passage from Gun Island, and I quote again, "After a few minutes, the director's voice was heard again. He told us that his staff had been hard at work and had found an alternative venue for the conference, none other than the hotel where we were staying. A hall and a suite of meeting rooms had been made available to us, so apart from a few minor adjustments, everything would go ahead as planned." He ended with a cry that roused a chorus of cheers. "We've got to show Mother Nature that we are not quitters." These examples mirror what I observe in my research. Cultures of ignorance among a global elite that allow them to look away from ecological crisis, while local communities must directly contend with their consequences. As Gosch's novel illustrates, the non-human world continually asserts itself in ways that challenge human dominance, offering a reminder that we are deeply entangled with and maybe ultimately reliant upon the modern human actors we so often attempt to control. Gosch's approach is crucial in understanding the Anthropocene, I believe, not as a purely human-centered epoch, but as one shaped by multi-species interactions and the persistent agency of non-humans that surround us. I do have a few concluding remarks. I thought, when I finished the book, then I thought, okay, how does this resonate with my discipline, anthropology? I mean, we can talk about it later too, but I sensed him being an anthropologist as well. Maybe I'm wrong or maybe not. We can discuss this later. But I thought this book really is a reminder that I think of the power of narratives in making sense of complex crises. And I read the Amazon reviews this morning, and there was a German customer complaining in German, and she wrote something like, why do we need this, and it doesn't solve problems. And yeah, that was probably not his goal, to solve climate change, but I do believe that through stories we can relate ourselves to the very complex dynamics we encounter, and they become a little bit more, I'd say, reliable or relatable. That was the word I was looking for. So he writes, "It is only through stories that the universe can speak to us, and if we don't learn to listen, you may be sure that we will be punished for it." And I think stories, whether anthropological or literary, or maybe a blend of both, serve as an essential tool for interpreting and responding to complex social and environmental phenomena. Whether documenting the lived experiences of refugees, exploring the precarities faced by coastal communities in the Caribbean, or crafting novels like Gun Island, storytelling becomes a vital mechanism for connecting the personal with the planetary, maybe helping us grapple with the profound certainties of our times. So that's what I thought when I read the book.
So, thank you for this very personal and also very full reflection on the novel. I think there's a lot of things that we could talk about. Would you maybe like 20 minutes, and then we'll have questions from the audience. I'm sure that a lot of people could relate. many of you might not have read the book, but I think that with the quotations and the little excerpts, you do have a good sense here. You already touched on that in the end in your reflection, but I wanted to ask you, maybe you could tell us a little bit more, because on your website institutional profile you also say your work very often links up or could link up with literary studies. And I was wondering, you said you've now read a book in a long time again, or a novel, but also with your sargassum project, are there algae stories as well, or do you also tap into narratives on the ground when you do field research? It's like what's the role of stories maybe in your own research?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that question. I do read. It's only the first time in years that I had the chance to read a novel and then connect it with my research, actually. I think for my PhD research with young refugees in Malta, novels played a larger role compared to what I'm doing now, in a way that I read novels written by authors from Somalia, and so it was just very helpful to better understand and maybe interpret the stories young refugees told me. I felt like I have a broader picture of what Somalia is like or could be like through novels, and a lot of the stories I heard from my research participants did resonate with what I read in novels. So that was very helpful in maybe contextualizing fieldwork stories with other fictional or non-fictional stories. Who knows? And that was great. And so I think in that way, ethnographic fieldwork can really benefit from novels, because we're always trying to contextualize the material we collect during fieldwork. Could be with other media outlets like newspaper articles or whatever you can find. So I think novels is one more way to contextualize interviews or whatever conversations we have during fieldwork. With the sargassum, not so much. There are very few stories that do depict. So sargassum is not a new algae. It's just new on the shores of the Caribbean, but it's always been in the Sargasso Sea in the Northern Atlantic. So there are very few accounts that do interpret sargassum as a barrier against colonizers. So there are stories of people who had hoped that sargassum would block Columbus. It didn't work out. But there is this idea of algae being able to act as a protector or as a border. So yes, but much less than compared to refugee stories.
When we talked before the Lunchtime Colloquium, you said you did not really relate to the refugees in the book. And you said there's also this, as you mentioned just now, what kind of stories do you need to tell as a refugee to actually be granted protection status? Environmental or climate change refugees or climate refugees is not really a thing legally. Did you come across any of that argumentation, or is that really not something that's relevant in terms of, climate-induced migration is not something that you would put forward if you're a refugee or if you're a migrant and look for refugee status?
I did. Well, when we talked, or what I realized when I read the novel, I had a hard time relating to any of the characters and actors, to be honest. It was not only with refugees in Venice, but particularly in these parts of the book. And then I wondered, is that because I usually do have a lot of empathy, so I was a bit surprised with like, what's happening? And I thought, is that intended? And we cannot answer this question, it's just what I thought, is like, was it the author's intention that readers should not emotionally connect with the refugees we encounter in the novel in Italy? And it did remind me of when we read newspaper articles about migration to the European Union. I did a side project on how the Maltese main newspaper represent migration to Malta between the 1970s and 2015. So Malta became part of the EU in 2004, so that's 20 years ago. And they've always had people coming to Malta under different arrangements, let's say, but obviously not under EU law. And so before the EU, before they joined, the way people talked about, and it was the way it was written about migrants or refugees, was with a lot more hospitality. It's like, oh yes, we are a hospitable country, we love to share, we welcome you. It was fewer people in numbers, yes, we should not forget that. But ever since 2004, they don't talk about refugees, it's always illegal immigrants. It's the pictures, when you go back, it's women with kids that you see in the newspapers. Now it's always single young men in groups on boats. So there's this idea of them not being able to, well, you cannot control them, right? So I think that's very important. And when I read the book, it's like, yeah, maybe the parts where he writes about the refugees or migrants in Venice, maybe he wants the same effect, that we cannot and maybe should not have empathy with people who come to Europe. So it did remind me of that discourse that I remember from Malta. Yeah, that's what I thought.
Well, I also have a hard time relating to some of the characters in the novel, especially the main character. That's my foe. But with the refugees, what I find interesting in the novel is that in the end, there is this moment of kind of like miraculous catharsis, and we have this miracle that actually happens that it's called a miracle. And you know, if a miracle happens, then the refugees are allowed to land, basically. And so for me, that was maybe a little bit more problematic. Not because I could not really relate to the characters, but because it seems so, you know, it seems so unrealistic that anything changes if it's not a miracle.
Oh yeah, and you asked me about the idea or the category of climate refugees, right? That never came up in the narratives the young refugees crafted, maybe. So that did not play a role on the bureaucratic level. But also not on the person level. So during research day, I got to know their official narratives and the actual reasons why they left Somalia. And they never talked about climate. Interesting. I mean, they did talk about their parents losing livestock. So yes, I believe with increasing droughts and everything, less access to water, there are climate-related issues, but they did not vocalize them. They told different stories. They said, yeah, I'm hungry, or I encounter a lot of domestic violence, or I was abused as a child soldier, or I want to be a doctor and I want to be educated, and I can't. I'm a woman, I'm a girl, I cannot access that level of education I want to have in Somalia. So those were the stories they told me why they left, but they are different from what they said to bureaucrats. And then also in Mexico with sargassum, there are areas where people cannot live along the coast any longer because of that algae. I mean, it has a horrible smell. You can get respiratory problems, tourism drops. That algae kills young juvenile fish in shallow water, so there is a part of it is also less access to food. But and some people left the coast and migrate further inland, but they would not talk about them being climate. I mean, they're not refugees when they stay in Mexico, but they would not say that they are victims of climate change.
Yeah.
Like that. It's not yet, maybe.
Do you think it's a useful category in research?
In research.
So do we, I mean, we see, especially in the environmental humanities, I think there's often a focus on climate change, and it has become a keyword, also highly debated. I mean, we had Mike Hume here a couple of weeks back, who warns that not everything should be about climate always, because that also erases or eradicates other problems or reasons, but would you think it's a useful category? Do you work with it?
Never. No, I don't work with it. And no way, the question if it's useful or not, I think I'm probably just not the right person to judge on that. I think for me as an anthropologist, what I always find interesting is what do people in the field use, right? So what when I worked with unaccompanied minors, so they were all so-called unbegleitete minderjährige Flüchtlinge or unaccompanied minors in English. So it's a legal category, and with that category you have certain rights and duties and you can't do other things. So, and I was interested in the question, what happens in people's everyday lives with that category once they are categorized? How do they deconstruct it? How do they make use of it? So, and then if we integrate climate refugees as a category, I'll be interested in what do people do with that category? What does it mean if you're categorized as a climate refugee? On the other hand, I mean, the reasons why we have the refugee category based on the 1951 Geneva Convention makes absolute sense to me why we have it. So the question is, do we want to expand it? Can we expand it? Do we want to integrate climate related reasons as reasons of recognition? I personally now just say yeah, because it does affect a lot of people, but it would have consequences again too, because we have a new category, and then we never know. I think the life categories take on once they are established, right? So there might be very unintended consequences we can't even think about. So that's my very spontaneous take on that category.
I think in the Nutmeg's Curse, Amitav Ghosh also muses about that, and he does not really, in Gun Island, he also does not use the category. I don't think that he ever really talks about climate change per se, but it seems to be a category that's also for those seemingly affected, not really relatable. It's not really used in that sense.
Yeah, and then the other point that you mentioned, if everything's now governed under the idea of climate change, what does it shadow? Like what? That's the invisibility thing again, right? So I just talked to a colleague who conducts field work in an island state in the Pacific, and on food and malnutrition. And so the stories he's hearing is, oh yeah, now you come again as a researcher and you again just want to find out that we don't know how to cook healthy, right? But we do know, but we lack financial resources. So it's not a lack of knowledge. And a lot of these programs in food, I think, attempt to say, oh, we need to educate people more. They need to know what a healthy diet is. But they do know. That's what his research shows, but they do know. It's not a lack of knowledge. They are very aware, but they don't have the resources. So this whole idea, I think, of them lacking knowledge shadows lacking financial resources. Yeah. So that's
and in economic inequalities, as you mentioned. Before we met here, you also talked a little bit about the Irrawaddy dolphin.
Yeah.
and how animals do defy borders or do just not recognize borders. Maybe that's an anecdote you also want to share, because I like that.
Yeah, it's a very personal story.
Yeah.
So I told Hannah before, but just today, that whales and dolphins, they have always been my favorite animals. And ever since I was a kid, actually. And a lot of my private travels are dedicated to whale watching or dolphin watching. So I remember it's been probably 10 years ago, I went to Laos on a kayak to see Irrawaddy dolphins, and they live in the Mekong River. And the river has forms lakes here and there, and then it's more of a river stream again, and lake and river and so on and so forth. And it's on the border between Laos and Cambodia. And we went with the kayak for hours. I was so tired, like, why did you even commit to this? And I wasn't sure if I actually make it back. And so we met the dolphins, everyone was super excited. And the tour guide said, oh yeah, stop your kayaks, because now they are in Cambodia. But you have to stay in Laos, right? And border guards observe what happens, and if you cross the border on the lake, they will make you pay. So they're just waiting for you to make a mistake. So he was always so saying, stay in Laos, stay in Laos, stay in Laos. And these dolphins, of course, they didn't care at all. Why should they, right? They were jumping around and they moved between Cambodia and Laos, and they didn't care, and they didn't have to care. But we as humans, there is this invisible border on the lake, and nobody really knew where exactly, but the tourists were like, now it's too far, come back. And yeah, that was my personal Irrawaddy dolphin encounter. And I just thought about it again when I read the book, and it's like, yeah, borders are very different for humans and non-humans.
And I can imagine that it's also a very interesting experience, maybe thought-provoking, to actually, we are quite privileged, we do travel a lot. But then being stopped by this invisible border on a lake, where you're just like, why? Yeah. It's not really a migrant experience, but it kind of also stops you and maybe puts the freedom that we usually encounter into perspective.
Yeah, and also when I read the book, the main character, he travels a lot in the book, right? So he's maybe like the anthropologist. I travel for my work quite a lot to the Caribbean, back and forth often. And so he travels a lot too. And then I thought, so why, right? And then I also thought, do we as humans only relate to problems, and do we really take them seriously when we see them? That's another question that I had. And the main character made me think about that too. Was it necessary that he constantly travels the world, or not? I would still answer that question to a certain degree with yes. I mean, ethnographic field work in far distant places. My carbon footprint is not great for my research. And then you can think about, how could you reduce it? Do we work with field assistants? Do we do more online? On the other hand, that personal experience working in the field led to very different research outcomes, I would argue. So me having clean beaches in the Caribbean for weeks does make me tell very different stories compared to interviewing beach cleaners once on Zoom for 30 minutes instead of living with them for weeks. So yeah. You asked whether Amitav Ghosh maybe is an anthropologist. He's trained as an anthropologist, but I also think that he does a lot of historical research and archival research, so I think he really immerses himself in his topics, and he has researched the Sundarbans for a long time, and Ghana Island has been kind of like a follow-up book to the Hungry Tide, so just as a little information there. Maybe do open up to the audience.